We like to imagine that the great action films of Hollywood arrived exactly as they were destined to be, as if every director who shaped them was the only person who ever could. But when you dig beneath the polished surface of studio history, you find a very different truth. Behind every blockbuster stands a trail of abandoned conversations, sudden withdrawals, and creative handoffs that almost sent these movies down entirely different paths. Hidden in those early drafts and half-forgotten negotiations are versions of these films that never came to life, shaped by directors who came close, sometimes inches close, to taking control. Picture what it would mean if the most recognizable action movies of the last 4 decades had been sculpted by filmmakers with radically different instincts. Imagine a Tarantino thriller disguised as a hostage film, a Fincher-toned psychological descent hidden beneath the shell of a summer spectacle, or a Cameron-sized epic that was once attached to a film far smaller than his usual terrain. These possibilities weren't distant fantasies, they were real crossroads, moments when the entire identity of a movie hung on a single decision. In the world of development meetings, competing visions often collide. One director wants to push for emotional grit, another demands heightened stylization, while the studio frantically chases commercial certainty. Schedules shift, egos clash, scripts mutate, and the version that survives is rarely the only one that existed. For every iconic film, there is a phantom reflection, a project that nearly was, shaped by hands that never touched the final frame. And once you start tracing these abandoned timelines, you realize just how fragile the creative process truly is. One rejected pitch, one declined offer, one abrupt exit, and the movie you know would have been transformed into something unrecognizable. Tonight, we're stepping straight into those hidden intersections. Let's explore 15 Hollywood action movies that were almost directed by someone else. Fact 1. Die Hard, 1988. The Almost Verhoeven version. Before Die Hard became the lean, human-driven thriller that reshaped the entire action genre, the project hovered on the edge of a drastically different fate. Early in development, before the studio had decided on tone or momentum, the script briefly found its way to Paul Verhoeven, fresh off the upheaval caused by RoboCop, and already known for marrying violence with biting social commentary. For a brief but very real moment, the film teetered toward a world guided by Verhoeven's brutal sense of satire. The producers were still unsure what they wanted from Die Hard. The source novel carried a bleak cynicism that Verhoeven instinctively understood, and his reputation for pushing boundaries made him an unexpected but intriguing candidate. The idea of turning a hostage thriller into a political dissection of corporate power appealed to him, though he voiced concerns about whether the script fully matched the scope of his ambitions. Everyone understood that if he stepped in, the film would swell into something more provocative and less commercially predictable. But hesitation began to spread. Executives feared that Verhoeven's instinct to escalate violence and deepen the political undercurrents would drown out the emotional accessibility they hoped to maintain. His vision leaned toward discomfort, toward exposing rot rather than spotlighting heroism. As discussions dragged on, both sides realized they were moving in opposite directions, and Verhoeven quietly backed away. Had he directed, Die Hard might have abandoned its balance of humor and tension, transforming instead into a harsh portrait of corruption and carnage. McClane would likely have become a far darker figure, and Nakatomi Plaza, a symbol of systemic decay rather than the stage for a white-knuckle rescue. The franchise that followed and the action landscape it influenced might have taken a very different shape. Instead, John McTiernan stepped forward, grounding the story in instinct, vulnerability, and charisma. The version we know emerged. The Verhoeven version dissolved a powerful reminder that one step in another direction could have rewritten action movie history. Fact 2. Speed, 1994. Quentin Tarantino almost took the wheel, long before Speed became the streamlined, propulsive bomb on a bus thriller we know today. The project nearly veered in an entirely different direction. When early drafts were circulating around Hollywood, the studio quietly reached out to Quentin Tarantino, who at the time was riding the growing notoriety of Reservoir Dogs and shaping the universe that would soon lead to Pulp Fiction. His fingerprints, sharp dialogue, wild unpredictability, and chaotic humor would have transformed the movie into something far stranger. Tarantino reportedly examined the premise and immediately saw potential, not in the spectacle, but in the conversations trapped inside that speeding bus. He imagined passengers trading philosophical arguments, criminals waxing poetic about pop culture, and a tense psychological battle between cop and bomber that relied more on verbal duels than explosions. The script, however, wasn't written for that kind of storytelling. It was constructed for velocity, not monologue. The conflict between artistic visions emerged quickly. The studio feared Tarantino would overshadow the suspense with stylized detours and morally ambiguous character beats. Meanwhile, Tarantino felt hemmed in by the structural simplicity of the plot, a single idea stretched over a relentless timeline. With Pulp Fiction ramping up, he stepped away, leaving behind a shadow of a film that might have been. Had he accepted the job, Speed would have been less of a thrill ride and more of a pressure cooker, a loud, talk-heavy, darkly comedic portrait of desperation. The danger would have come not only from the bomb, but from the personalities trapped together at 70 miles per hour. Instead, Jan de Bont brought razor-sharp focus and relentless momentum, crafting a film that became a defining action piece of the decade. The Tarantino version now exists only as a cinematic phantom. Fact 3. Alien 3, 1992. Rennie Harlin's Lost Expansion. Before Alien 3 descended into the grim, oppressive nightmare audiences, remember, the production hovered on the edge of a far bolder reinvention. Rising director Rennie Harlin, fresh from the success of A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and preparing for Die Hard 2, was brought in early to reshape the franchise. And his ideas were nothing short of ambitious. Harlin pushed to break the series out of its enclosed settings. He imagined new worlds, fresh environments, and a broader mythology that would expand the xenomorph's presence across the galaxy. His pitches were cinematic leaps forward, new colonies, scientific outposts, and the first true exploration of how the creature might evolve beyond the confines of a single hive. It was a direction that excited him but unsettled the studio. Fox executives, still wrestling with the legacy of Aliens, feared the franchise drifting too far from the claustrophobic terror that defined it. They wanted a return to darkness, not a cosmic expansion. Each meeting grew more strained as Harlin pushed for scope while the studio demanded containment. Weeks of creative stalemate followed. Eventually, Harlin withdrew rather than compromise his vision. What remained behind was a scattered production already sliding into chaos. When David Fincher entered, he inherited the wreckage and shaped it into something more intimate, more bleak, more punishing. If Harlin had stayed, Alien 3 might have evolved into a sweeping sci-fi odyssey, less despair, more discovery, less confinement, more universe building. Instead, the film contracted inward, becoming one of the most infamous troubled productions in Hollywood history. Harlin's version exists only in fragments, notes, memories, and the lingering question of what the franchise might have become had the studio embraced a larger horizon. Fact 4. Mission Impossible 1990. Sidney Pollack's vanished interpretation. Before Mission Impossible became a labyrinth of shifting loyalties and stylized espionage under Brian De Palma. The film nearly took shape under a director known for gravitas, emotional nuance, and political tension, Sidney Pollack. His prior collaboration with Tom Cruise on The Firm made him a natural early candidate, and for a period, the studio believed he could anchor the adaptation with a grounded, character-driven approach. Pollack examined the script and saw a story about fractured alliances and moral erosion. His vision leaned toward a slower, more methodical thriller, one where every conversation carried a threat and every glance hinted at betrayal. He imagined a world where the action was secondary, where the psychological stakes mattered more than the gadgets or elaborate set pieces. It would have been a spy film built on unease rather than spectacle, but the producers, sensing the potential for a blockbuster franchise, began leaning toward a more kinetic interpretation. Pollack's inclination for restrained tension clashed with their hunger for bold visual identity and international-scale stunts. As creative meetings piled up, it became clear the project was veering in a direction Pollack thought diluted its emotional core. Recognizing the widening gap, he stepped back. The tonal compass of the film then pointed toward De Palma, whose flair for paranoia, misdirection, and operatic visual style aligned precisely with the studio's ambitions. Had Pollack taken the director's chair, Mission Impossible might have evolved into a quiet storm of mistrust, a chess match, rather than an adrenaline engine. Instead, it emerged as an iconic thriller powered by stylistic bravado and a genre-defining vault sequence. Fact 5. RoboCop 1987, the Cronenberg body horror that never happened. Before Paul Verhoeven reshaped RoboCop into a savage satire of corporate decay and media-driven culture, the project was briefly in the orbit of David Cronenberg, a filmmaker whose relationship with flesh, technology, and identity would have twisted the film's DNA into something far more disturbing. Cronenberg saw in the story not a mechanized superhero but a tragic hybrid, a man whose body had been invaded and rewritten by machinery. scenery. He envisioned a narrative steeped in transformation, where Murphy's reconstruction would be shown in grotesque, intimate detail, not as an act of salvation, but as a violation. The cybernetic suit, under his direction, would have symbolized a horrifying loss of self rather than a rebirth. But the studio recoiled from his ideas. They wanted punchy action and sharp humor, something audiences could rally behind. Cronenberg's treatments, dense with existential dread and biological anxiety, pushed the film toward territory they feared was too cerebral, too unsettling, and too alienating for mainstream viewers. Tensions grew, and he eventually departed, leaving behind the seed of a film that would never germinate. Verhoeven entered and shifted the narrative towards satire, replacing existential horror with razor-edged commentary and explosive violence. The result became a cult classic, brutal, funny, and strangely triumphant. Had Cronenberg stayed, RoboCop might have been remembered not as a crowd-pleaser, but as one of cinema's most haunting meditations on bodily autonomy and technological intrusion. A completely different legacy, still powerful, but far less accessible. Fact 6. Blade 2, 2002. Stephen Norrington's abandoned path. Before Guillermo del Toro transformed Blade 2 into a baroque collision of martial arts choreography and monstrous reinvention, the studio had fully expected Stephen Norrington, the director of the first Blade, to return. For months, he was at the center of early development, shaping a drastically different sequel than the one that ultimately reached the screen. Norrington didn't want to repeat himself. His concept leaned toward an atmospheric, noir-inspired exploration of Blade's isolation-less creature spectacle, more fractured psychology. He pictured a world bathed in cold shadows, where the vampire underworld was not evolving into grotesque mutations, but splintering into rival factions driven by paranoia and betrayal. His sequel would have been quieter, more introspective, and visually stripped down. But the producers had other ambitions. They wanted escalation, larger threats, more elaborate designs, and a deeper dive into biological horror. Norrington resisted the push toward mutation-focused lore, believing it cheapened the elegance of the first film. Creative meetings grew increasingly strained as the studio leaned into the monstrous, operatic tone they wanted the franchise to adopt. Eventually, Norrington exited rather than compromise. Del Toro stepped in and embraced exactly what Norrington rejected. His love of creature design reshaped the entire aesthetic of the film, birthing the Reapers and turning Blade 2 into a visceral, textured symphony of predators, hunting predators. Had Norrington remained, the film might have retreated into noir minimalism. Instead, it became a vivid, blood-soaked myth driven by artistic flamboyance. Fact 7. The Rock, 1996. The Tony Scott film that slipped away. Before Michael Bay stamped The Rock with his signature blend of muscular spectacle and sun-drenched chaos, the film hovered in the hands of another master of atmospheric tension, Tony Scott. Known for sculpting images that seemed to glow from within, Scott was first approached when the project was still a muddle of drafts and tonal confusion. Scott saw a different film than the one we ultimately received. His early conversations with producers centered around a version steeped in paranoia, where the Alcatraz takeover unfolded as a slow mutiny rather than a bombastic assault. He was drawn to the tragedy of Hummel, less a villain than a soldier strangled by a system that abandoned him. Under Scott, the story would have leaned into moral grayness, into sweat-drenched conversations in dimly lit rooms, into tension that simmered rather than exploded. But the producers were torn. They admired Scott's command of character tension, yet feared his dramatic instincts would overpower the brisk, adrenaline-driven identity they wanted. The longer the discussions continued, the more apparent the divide became. Scott drifted away, and the film pivoted toward a younger director with an appetite for kinetic excess. Bay delivered precisely that, a symphony of explosions, one-liners, and relentless momentum. The Scott version, quieter and more morally tangled, evaporated. Had he stayed, The Rock might have become a bruising meditation on loyalty rather than one of the defining action films of the 90 seconds. Fact 8. Total Recall, 1990. Cronenberg's lost mindscape. Before Total Recall erupted into a violent, satirical rush under Paul Verhoeven, it lived for years in the imagination of David Cronenberg. He spent nearly a decade refining drafts, reshaping characters, and steering the concept towards something colder, stranger, and far more psychologically invasive. Cronenberg didn't see Total Recall as a crowd-pleasing odyssey. He saw it as a descent. He pushed for a narrative where identity eroded piece by piece, where Quaid's struggle wasn't about revolution, but about surviving the collapse of his own mind. His Mars would have been grotesque, not heroic, filled with unsettling biotech, mutations as metaphors rather than spectacle, and technology that felt like an infection. The studio balked. They wanted a visual thrill ride, a film that shouted rather than whispered. Cronenberg's deliberate pace and intimate horror clashed with their pursuit of blockbuster energy. After countless rewrites and disagreements, he stepped away, leaving behind the remnants of a film that would never be. Verhoeven arrived and tore the concept wide open, embracing chaos, bloodshed, and the thrill of rebellion. His interpretation was louder, bolder, and wildly entertaining. The contrast between visions was so stark that it now feels as though two completely different movies were born from the same bones. Had Cronenberg stayed, Total Recall might have stood as one of cinema's most disturbing reflections on memory and identity, rather than the muscular sci-fi classic it became. Fact 9. Lethal Weapon 1987, Leonard Nimoy's softer, unmade cut. Before Richard Donner unleashed the raw volatility that made Lethal Weapon a cornerstone of the buddy cop genre, the studio invited Leonard Nimoy, fresh from his success directing Star Trek III and IV, to consider the project. His reputation for exploring emotional connections and layered character interactions made him an intriguing candidate, at least on paper. Nimoy admired the script's wounded heart, the despair eating away at Riggs, the grounded warmth of Murtaugh, but he recoiled at the brutality that held the story together. He envisioned a version more reflective, more compassionate, a story where the partnership healed both men without dragging them through the fire. His instincts leaned toward introspection rather than violence, toward emotional recovery rather than explosive confrontation. The studio quickly sensed the mismatch. They wanted an edge, a sense of danger, a film that ran hot and unfiltered. Nimoy's tendency toward gentler emotional terrain clashed with the script's pulse. After several meetings, he declined, admitting he wasn't ready to tell a story so steeped in pain and violence. Once he stepped aside, Donner entered and embraced the chaos, the danger, the mania, the sharp emotional fractures that defined Riggs's journey. Under his direction, the film became a live wire, dangerous, unhinged, unforgettable. Had Nimoy directed, Lethal Weapon would have been a quieter drama about two broken men learning to lean on each other, not the explosive genre landmark it became. Fact 10. Predator 1987, the director who almost replaced McTiernan. Before John McTiernan ultimately shaped Predator into one of the most primal, atmospheric action films ever made, he actually walked away from the project the first time it came across his desk. That momentary refusal opened the door for another set of directors, less visionary, more conventional, who were quietly considered as emergency replacements. Had negotiations shifted even slightly, Predator might have fallen into far more ordinary hands. The early script didn't yet have its mythic identity. It read like a standard creature feature, loud, gory, and predictable. McTiernan saw no depth in it and hesitated, believing the film lacked purpose beyond the monster. Meanwhile, the studio, desperate to start production, began sounding out other directors known for mid-budget action work. Their versions would have leaned heavily into surface-level thrills, without the slow tightening of atmosphere that later defined the movie. But something changed when McTiernan revisited the material. He saw the potential for a different kind of action film, one built on silence, dread, and the unsettling reversal of hunter and hunted. He returned to the table, and the studio froze their conversations with the backup candidates. Without that shift in perspective, another director would have stepped in and dragged Predator into formulaic territory. Had one of those candidates taken charge, the film might have lacked its iconic restraint, the creeping tension, the jungle as a suffocating presence, the Predator's mythic aura. Instead of a psychological unraveling, it would have been another noisy, disposable monster movie. McTiernan came back in time, and in doing so, he saved the film from mediocrity. The alternative Predator routine, shallow, forgettable, vanished the moment he picked up the script again. Fact 11. The Bourne Identity 2002. Spike Lee's unmade political thriller. Before Doug Liman reimagined the spy genre with the stripped-down realism of The Bourne Identity, Universal flirted with a drastically different direction. Spike Lee, known for confrontational storytelling and razor-sharp political awareness, Lee saw in Jason Bourne not just a lost assassin, but a man trapped in the machinery of American power. For a brief stretch, he was considered the director who might redefine what an espionage film could be. Lee read the early script and immediately gravitated toward the themes of institutional betrayal, Bourne as a discarded weapon trying to reclaim his humanity. His interpretation leaned toward a much heavier political tone. He wanted a story that indicted the system that created Bourne, not simply a chase narrative. The CIA would have been a looming, oppressive force, Bourne's guilt more pronounced, his awakening more tragic than thrilling. Universal hesitated. They weren't seeking provocation, they were building a franchise. Lee's emphasis on systemic critique and moral inquiry felt too volatile. His Bourne would question the world, theirs would outrun it. The disconnect sharpened quickly, and Lee stepped away before the project could harden into something he didn't believe in. Doug Liman entered with a different philosophy: keep the action grounded, the tone cool, the politics understated. Under his hand, the Bourne identity became a sleek reinvention of spy cinema, laying the groundwork for one of Hollywood's most influential modern franchises. Had Spike Lee stayed, Bourne might have become a symbol of political resistance, a commentary as much as a thriller. Instead, the film embraced momentum over ideology, and Lee's version dissolved into Hollywood's vast archive of unrealized possibilities. Fact 12. Face Divided by Off, 1997. Rob Cohen's psychological thriller that never materialized. Before John Woo turned Face Divided by Off into a kinetic opera of bullets, identities, and emotional excess, the project first floated to Rob Cohen. In its earliest life, Face Divided by Off was conceived as a colder, more clinical piece of speculative fiction, far removed from the heightened, stylized world Woo would later build. Cohen, who was emerging as a reliable action stylist, seriously considered taking the reins. Cohen approached the concept with a fascination for the horror of identity displacement. The idea of two men forced to live inside each other's physical form intrigued him, but not in an operatic way. He envisioned the story unfolding as a psychological descent rather than an action spectacle, a chilling exploration of ego, dissolution, paranoia, and the existential terror of losing one's face to another man's life. Action would have existed, but only as punctuation, not the language of the film. Producers were divided. Some appreciated the cerebral possibilities, but most feared the tone would become too cold, too intellectual, too small for the big-budget aspirations they had in mind. They wanted fluid gunplay, emotional melodrama, and the kind of stylistic bravado that would make the film explode off the screen. Cohen's restrained approach clashed with their escalating vision. Once he stepped away, destiny pointed toward John Woo, who reshaped the film into a symphony of doves, slow-motion standoffs, and operatic duality that redefined action cinema. Woo didn't just accept the script, he transformed it. If Cohen had directed, Face Divided by Off would have been a tighter, moodier thriller. Fascinating, perhaps, but far less iconic. Its emotional largeness, its theatricality, its bold strangeness, all of it would simply not exist. Fact 13. Top Gun, 1986. The John Carpenter take that never took flight. Before Tony Scott wrapped Top Gun in golden sunsets and high-octane bravado, the studio briefly courted a far darker filmmaker, John Carpenter. Fresh from reshaping genre cinema with The Thing and Escape from New York, Carpenter carried a command of mood, isolation, and psychological fragility qualities that would have taken the aviation drama into surprising territory. Carpenter read the concept and saw past the swagger. He was drawn to the human cost of aerial combat, the isolation of young pilots pushed to the edge of mortality, the crushing expectations, the strange brotherhood forged in the shadow of death. In his mind, Top Gun would have pulsed with dread rather than triumph. Maverick would be less a heroic prodigy and more a man riding the knife edge between brilliance and breakdown. But Paramount and the US Navy had no appetite for that direction. They envisioned a film that could inspire, recruit, elevate. Carpenter's gritty paranoia clashed directly with the polished image the Pentagon wanted to project. His refusal to soften the story ultimately ended the conversation. The studio shifted towards someone who could deliver fantasy rather than confrontation. Tony Scott answered that call, turning the film into a neon hymn to speed, adrenaline, and American mythology. Carpenter's version, stripped of glamour and drowning in psychological tension, vanished before it ever reached the runway. Had he stayed, Top Gun might have been remembered not as a cultural phenomenon, but as a haunting character study about men who soar too close to the Sunday. Fact 14. The Terminator, 1984. John Milius and the Path Not Taken. Before James Cameron reshaped science fiction with the relentless minimalism of the Terminator, the project drifted briefly near the orbit of John Milius, the volcanic writer-director behind Conan the Barbarian and Red Dawn. His reputation for mythic storytelling and militaristic grandeur made him, for a moment, a candidate in the earliest stage of development. Milius saw potential for a completely different film. Rather than a tight, night-soaked chase, he imagined a sweeping war prophecy, drenched in fatalism and legend. The Terminator itself would have been cast less as a machine and more as a mythic antagonist, an embodiment of destiny rather than a cold, efficient killer. Milius favored scope, symbolism, and a sense of ancient inevitability. His treatment leaned toward operatic conflict rather than claustrophobic terror. But reality intervened. The film's budget was microscopic, and the producers needed a director who could work within extreme limitations. Milius's taste for scale was incompatible with the financial constraints. There were additional concerns that his thematic obsessions, honor, warfare, masculine mythology, would pull the story too far from its grounded sci-fi horror roots. The idea quietly faded. When Cameron took control, he narrowed everything. The tension, the stakes, the world. His version became a nightmare rendered with ruthless efficiency. No epic scope, no sweeping battles, just a woman, a machine, and fate closing in. Had Milius remained, the Terminator might have looked like a dystopian epic told from a battlefield. Fascinating, perhaps, but devoid of the terrifying precision that made the final film unforgettable. Fact 15. Mad Max 1979. Philip Noyce's alternate road. Before George Miller unleashed the raw, feral energy of Mad Max, the project passed through the hands of Philip Noyce, one of Australia's most promising young directors of the era. He was intrigued by the script's themes of social breakdown and moral exhaustion, but his instincts led him toward a quieter, more introspective form of storytelling. Noyce viewed Mad Max not as a myth forged in gasoline and metal, but as a psychological portrait, a slow unraveling of a good man trapped in a world sliding into barbarism. His version would have focused on Max's interior crisis rather than vehicular mayhem. The stunts, the chases, the iconic vehicular insanity would have been restrained, replaced by a drama centered on grief, disillusionment, and the suffocating collapse of order. Producers sensed a mismatch almost immediately. What drew Miller to the story? The visceral energy, the speed, the brutal inventiveness held little appeal for Noyce. His sensibilities leaned toward controlled emotion and thematic subtlety, not the anarchic, outlaw road energy the film demanded. The more conversations unfolded, the clearer it became that he and the material were traveling in different directions. When Noyce stepped away, Miller embraced the project with the ferocity of someone determined to redefine what action cinema could be. His kinetic approach, raw, unfiltered, and bordering on reckless, created a cinematic world that felt dangerous, alive, and unlike anything before it. Had Noyce directed, Mad Max would have been a somber tragedy. Instead, Miller delivered a myth carved from chrome, dust, and rage. Bonus fact: Demolition Man 1993, the Tim Burton future that never saw daylight. This one didn't make the top 15, but it may be the strangest near miss of them all. In the earliest stage of development, before the tone of Demolition Man had settled, before it chose between satire, dystopia, and explosive action, Warner Brothers briefly courted a director who could have turned the entire film into a surrealist fable, Tim Burton. Fresh off the visual shockwaves of Batman and the emotional oddity of Edward Scissorhands, Burton had become Hollywood's patron saint of the uncanny. When he looked at the initial concept, a cryogenically frozen cop awakened in a pristine, eerily sanitized future, he didn't see an action playground. He saw a world stripped of emotional texture. A society so perfectly engineered it had become spiritually hollow. Burton envisioned a future Los Angeles rendered as a porcelain dreamscape, where every smile felt painted on, and every building seemed crafted from childhood nightmares. But the producers wanted something very different. They wanted explosions, swagger, and a comic edge, not a melancholic descent into dystopian whimsy. Burton's ideas were too eccentric, too atmospheric, too resistant to conventional spectacle. His version would have turned the movie into a fable about conformity and emotional suppression, not a clash between Stallone's brute force and Wesley Snipes' anarchic chaos. As soon as Burton walked away, the project swung violently toward action comedy. The dystopia became sillier, the satire louder, and the violence more playful. The Burton future, haunting, delicate, uncanny, vanished as if it had never existed. Had he directed, Demolition Man might have been a strange, dreamlike parable instead of the bombastic cult classic it became. We've just stepped through the hidden doors of a Hollywood that almost existed a parallel timeline shaped by directors who came close enough to touch these films, yet vanished before leaving a single frame behind. Now that you've seen how fragile these productions truly were, the question turns to you. Which of these alternate visions do you wish you could watch? Would you have wanted a darker Top Gun, a more cerebral RoboCop, or a Total Recall built on psychological ruin instead of spectacle? And more importantly, do you think Hollywood made the right choices, or did it walk away from something greater? Tell us which almost version fascinates you the most.